The ultimate inheritance. How I turned my parents' favoritism into sweet revenge. My parents wrote me out of their will, leaving everything to my brother. You were never good enough, they said, looking me straight in the eye. I didn't argue. Years later, when my brother squandered it all and they realized they had nothing left, they came to me with a proposal they thought I'd never refuse. I never thought I'd have a story worth sharing here. But life has a way of surprising you. I don't know if this is more entitled parents or pro-revenge, but I'll let you decide. For some background, I'm 38M, and my family was the kind where favoritism wasn't just obvious, it was practically a family tradition. My parents, George and Martha, had 2 sons, my older brother, Charles 40M, and me. Charles was the golden child, the prodigy, the one who would make the family proud. Me? I was just there. It was subtle at first. When we were kids, Charles always got first pick of everything. The best clothes, the bigger bedroom, the newest gadgets. I got his leftovers. He's older, it makes sense, our parents would say. But even as a kid, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. It only got worse as we grew up. Charles could wreck the car, fail a class, get into fights. It didn't matter. Our parents would find a way to defend him. He's just going through a rough patch. You know how hard it is being the eldest. He'll get back on track. Me. If I so much as forgot to take out the trash, I was lazy, irresponsible, and a disappointment. When Charles went to college, our parents drained their savings to cover everything. Tuition, a car, an apartment. We're investing in his future. When it was my turn, we can't afford to send you. Maybe try community college. I took out loans, worked multiple jobs, and figured it out myself. No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough for them. You should be more like Charles. Why aren't you as ambitious as your brother? Then came the moment that should have hurt, but honestly by then I was just numb. A few years after college, they sat me down and told me they were leaving everything to Charles. Their savings, their house, any assets. All of it. Not a penny for me. My mother didn't even flinch when she said it. You were never good enough. I remember staring at them, waiting for a punchline that never came. My father just nodded, like this was the most rational decision in the world. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just walked away and I didn't look back. I built my own life, worked harder than ever, and grew successful in ways they never imagined. Over time I barely spoke to them. Why would I? Every conversation was the same. Charles was thriving, he wasn't. I should reach out to him more, I wouldn't. And they had zero interest in what I was doing. Then out of nowhere, my parents called me. They wanted to have dinner, just the 3 of us. I already knew something was wrong. And oh, I was right. See, it turns out Charles had done what I always knew he would. He squandered everything. Every cent of the inheritance, the house, the investments, gone. Bad deals, reckless spending, maybe some gambling. They were vague, but I got the picture. And now my parents had nothing. For the first time in years, they actually wanted to talk to me. We met at a nice restaurant, one I knew they couldn't afford anymore. My mother, usually so composed, looked nervous. My father was quieter than I'd ever seen him. Then my mother cleared her throat and said, "We've been thinking, and we have a proposal for you." I leaned back, arms crossed, and just waited. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I wasn't about to make this easy for them. Martha glanced at George, clearly expecting him to start, but he just stared at the table, running a finger along the rim of his empty water glass. That was new. My father was never the quiet type. So my mother took the lead. "Your brother has been struggling," she started, folding her hands in front of her like she was about to deliver some noble speech. "Things have been difficult for him." I stayed silent, letting her squirm. She hesitated, then pressed on. "We know there's been distance between us, but we're still family, and families should support each other." There it was. I took a sip of my drink, just to see if she'd get impatient. She did. "Charles has made some mistakes." George finally spoke, his voice measured, careful. That was new too. He was usually the type to bark orders, to lay down the law. But now he wasn't in control. And he knew it. I tilted my head. "What kind of mistakes?" Martha sighed dramatically. "Well, business has been challenging. The economy has been unpredictable. And Charles's investments. He lost everything, didn't he?" I cut in. She flinched. George's jaw tightened. It was an unfortunate series of events, but the point is, he's trying to recover. And he needs a little help getting back on his feet. I let out a quiet chuckle, shaking my head. They really thought they could dress this up like it was some noble cause. Like I just nod along and agree to help. And what does this have to do with me? I asked, feigning curiosity. Martha leaned forward slightly. Well, we were hoping you could offer some support. Just temporarily. Support. I repeated. You mean money? Martha pursed her lips. Don't say it like that. George cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. You've done well for yourself. We know that, and we're proud of you. I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. Proud? They hadn't cared about anything I'd done until this very moment. Until they needed something. Proud. I echoed, letting the word hang in the air. That's funny. You never seemed all that proud before. Martha's smile tightened. Oh, come on, that's not fair. You know we've always wanted the best for you. That's interesting because I seem to remember sitting at our kitchen table years ago, while you told me I wasn't good enough. And now suddenly you're proud? Now that Charles has ruined everything. George's expression darkened. He didn't like being challenged, but he still wasn't in a position to argue. Martha exhaled sharply. Look, we don't need to rehash the past. What matters is the present. Charles is struggling and we thought. You thought I'd fix it. Silence. They didn't deny it. I tapped a finger against the table, pretending to think. So let me get this straight. You gave him everything, your savings, the house, your full support. You made sure he never had to struggle a day in his life, while I had to work for everything on my own. And now, after he's thrown it all away, you're coming to me, the son who wasn't good enough to inherit anything, and you want me to just hand over my hard-earned money to fix Charles's mess. Martha's lips thinned. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. George finally spoke again, his voice low and controlled. It's not just about Charles. We're struggling too. I looked between them, finally seeing it. How worn out they looked, how their expensive clothes were just slightly outdated. How they were trying so hard to project control even as their world crumbled around them. They weren't just asking for money for Charles, they needed it for themselves. So what's your plan? I asked. Let's say I agree. How much are you expecting me to give? Martha hesitated. We were thinking a loan, George said carefully. A loan. I repeated. Meaning you'd pay me back. They both nodded eagerly, as if saying it out loud would make it true. And what exactly would you be paying me back with? I asked, tilting my head. Silence. I smiled. They had nothing. They were asking for a loan they couldn't repay, expecting me to just give them the money out of some misplaced sense of obligation. And the best part? They still didn't see what was coming. I leaned forward slightly, letting the silence stretch between us. Let me get this straight, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You wrote me out of your will, left me with nothing, told me to my face that I wasn't good enough. And now that your golden boy has burned everything to the ground, you expect me to save you. Martha's jaw clenched. George straightened. We are still your parents. I smiled. Oh, I know. I set my napkin on the table, stretching my fingers like I was getting ready for something. Which I was. Which is why I'm going to make you an offer of my own. I watched as both their expressions shifted, hopeful, relieved. I took my time, glancing down at the table, pretending to consider my words. Then I met their eyes and said, I'll help you. Martha exhaled a breath she must have been holding. George's shoulders relaxed. The relief in their expressions was almost comical. But I added, leaning back slightly, we need to be clear about what help actually means. George frowned. We're not asking for much, just enough to get back on our feet. Oh, I know, I said smoothly. But here's the thing. I don't do handouts. And I definitely don't do favors for people who have made it clear that I don't matter to them. Martha scoffed. That's not fair. We raised you, didn't we? We fed you. Put a roof over your head. I held up a hand. Just don't. I have no interest in hearing how I should be grateful for the bare minimum of parenting. George narrowed his eyes. Then what's your offer? I smiled. I'll buy the house. Martha blinked. What? You heard me. I folded my hands in front of me. You're broke. The house is your last real asset, right? Sell it to me. George's face darkened. That house has been in our family for generations. And yet you were willing to sign it over to Charles without a second thought. I shrugged. I'm offering you a way out. Sell it to me, and you'll have enough to start fresh somewhere else. You might not be able to maintain the lifestyle you're used to, but you won't be homeless. Martha's mouth opened and closed, her face twisting between outrage and desperation. We're not selling our home to our own son. Why not? You didn't mind cutting me out of it before. I let that hang in the air for a moment before adding, and let's be real, you don't have many other options. George clenched his jaw. We could sell to someone else. I nodded, feigning interest. Sure, go ahead. But the market isn't great right now, is it? And how fast do you think you'll be able to sell? Meanwhile, I have the money right now. I could see the gears turning in their heads. They hated this, hated the idea of handing the house over to me, hated that they weren't in control anymore. We'd have to think about it, Martha said stiffly. I leaned back unfazed. Take your time. But just so you know, my offer has an expiration date. Every day you wait, I'll lower the amount I'm willing to pay. George's eyes snapped to mine. You wouldn't. I smirked. You sure about that? The best part? I wasn't bluffing. I knew they had no other way out. I knew they'd be forced to come crawling back to me. A week passed before they called me. I let it go to voicemail. Another 2 days later, I got a text from Martha. We'd like to discuss your offer. I waited another full day before replying. Let me know when and where. They hated that. They weren't used to waiting on me. But they had no choice. When we met again, they were visibly more drained, less put together than before. I knew why. I'd been keeping tabs on the house. They'd tried to find another buyer, but the market was slow, and no one was willing to pay what they were asking. Even worse, Charles had creditors breathing down his neck. I wasn't sure the exact details, but I heard whispers that he'd taken out some loans he couldn't repay. They were desperate. George cleared his throat as I sat down. We've considered your offer. Martha nodded, forcing a stiff smile. We're willing to sell. I leaned back in my chair. Great, but the offer has changed. Martha stiffened. Excuse me. I shrugged. I told you my offer would go down the longer you waited. The market isn't getting any better, and my interest has decreased. George clenched his fists. That's ridiculous. You have more than enough money to buy it at the original price. I gave him a slow, knowing smile. Oh, I know I do. But that's not the point. I watched as realization dawned on them. This wasn't about the money. This was about making them feel what I had felt. Powerless, unwanted, like their fate was no longer in their hands. Martha's nostrils flared, but she pressed her lips together, forcing herself to stay calm. And what is your new offer? I slid a contract across the table. I'll buy the house for half of what I originally offered. Martha's face turned red. That's robbery. I tilted my head. It's business. They sat there, stewing in their own bitterness, hating every second of this. I could see it in the way Martha's fingers clenched around the pen, the way George's jaw tightened so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. They weren't just signing over the house. They were signing away their pride, their sense of superiority, their illusion of control. I let the silence stretch, watching as they hesitated, as if hoping I'd change my mind and take pity on them. But I didn't. I simply waited completely at ease, because I knew how this would end. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she hovered over the signature line. She looked up at me one last time, desperation flickering in her eyes. Are you really going to do this to us? She whispered. I didn't blink. You already did it to me. I'm just making things even. She exhaled shakily, then put pen to paper. George was next. He signed with sharp, angry strokes, as if the ink itself could convey his fury. When he was done, he shoved the contract toward me, glaring. I hope you're happy, he spat. I picked up the papers, flipping through them leisurely before tucking them in my folder. Then I met his eyes and smiled. Oh, I am. And just like that, the house was mine. But here's the best part. After they moved out, I didn't keep it for myself. I turned it into a rental property. And the first person I rented it out to? Charles's ex-wife. When I reached out to her, she was thrilled. Apparently, Charles had left her in an awful financial situation. He had spent recklessly during their marriage, and when things went south, he drained their joint accounts, leaving her to pick up the pieces. She was struggling to find a stable place for herself and their kid, and the idea of living in the very house my parents had once so proudly gifted Charles? She found it deliciously poetic. She moved in almost immediately. She even sent me a thank you gift, an expensive bottle of whiskey with a note that simply said, "Best landlord ever." As for my parents, they relocated to a much smaller place, an old rundown rental in a neighborhood they used to look down on. Nothing luxurious, nothing like what they were used to. They went from their grand family home to a 2-bedroom apartment with noisy neighbors and outdated appliances. They complained, of course, to anyone who would listen. But sympathy was in short supply. Most people knew exactly what had happened. I heard from a relative that they're miserable, not just because of their new living situation, but because they can't stand the fact that I was the one who came out on top, that the son they dismissed as never good enough was now the one holding all the cards. And Charles? Well, let's just say karma had a field day with him. His reckless spending finally caught up. No more family fortune to bail him out, no more safety net. His credit was in ruins, and he was drowning in debt. Last I heard, he was couch-hopping between friends who were quickly running out of patience. So Reddit, am I the a-hole for making my parents sell me the house at a reduced price? Should I have been more forgiving, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this story of karma and revenge, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.